Hello from the SDG studio here at United Nations headquarters in New York. Welcome to this commemorative event on the 30th anniversary of the Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development and Program of Action. This event is organized by DESA, the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, in collaboration with the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research, or UNU-WIDER. My name is Shakuntala Santharan, Shax for short. I'll be moderating today. Our conversation will highlight the contributions of the Copenhagen Declaration to the Global Sustainable Development Agenda. We'll look at what progress has been made, the challenges we face, and what actions are needed to accelerate progress towards the commitments made at the Copenhagen Summit in 1995 and the broader set of Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. We'll begin by exploring new evidence and analysis from the soon-to-be-released World Social Report 2025. And then we have a high-level panel to talk about two major UN events later this year: the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development in Seville, Spain, and the 2nd World Summit for Social Development being held in Doha, Qatar. How can these events help strengthen the social dimension of sustainable development and accelerate progress towards the SDGs? Let's first find out more about the Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development, which was signed at the World Summit for Social Development on March 12, 1995. For the first time in history, world leaders gathered to recognize the significance of social development and human well-being for all, and to pledge to give these goals the highest priority into the 21st century. Never before had so many world leaders come together for such a purpose: to fight poverty, to create decent work, and to strengthen the social fabric. The central tenet of the Copenhagen Declaration is the importance of putting people at the center of development efforts. At the summit, governments committed to a progressively fairer distribution of opportunities and resources to foster social justice and equality. They also called for greater inclusion and participation of all people in economic, social, and political processes. In terms of goals, the Copenhagen Declaration aimed to ensure the well-being of all people and the harmonious functioning of society, notably through its 3 core commitments: eradicating poverty, promoting full employment, and fostering social integration. The Copenhagen Summit also stands out because of the political will shown by governments to comprehensively tackle social challenges, with the recognition that social development cannot be pursued as a sectoral initiative or in a piecemeal fashion. Rather, it requires an orientation of values, objectives, and priorities towards the well-being of all. It was also at the summit that world leaders clearly stated that economic development, social development, and environmental protection are interdependent and mutually reinforcing components of sustainable development. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development builds on the principles established in the Copenhagen Declaration. It incorporates a broad approach to sustainable development with 3 dimensions: economic, social, and environmental. The commitments made in the Copenhagen Declaration are reflected in the SDGs, particularly in the goals related to poverty reduction, decent work, and reduced inequalities. The principle of people-centered development is also echoed in the 2030 Agenda's commitment to leave no one behind. The Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development was a significant milestone in the pursuit of global social progress by addressing key social issues and promoting inclusive, sustainable development. The declaration laid the foundation for a better quality of life for all people. Its principles and commitments continue to inspire efforts to create a more equitable and just world now and in the future. And now we have a video message from UN Secretary-General António Guterres on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development.
Together, we can build a better world for all humanity. That conviction is at the foundation of the Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development, adopted 30 years ago. And it runs through the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Yet, today, life is marked by uncertainty and insecurity, fueling frustration and division. As this year's World Social Report shows, inequality, insecurity, and deep distrust are rife across the world. Countless people are struggling to make ends meet, while wealth and power concentrate at the top. Our planet is suffering from climate disasters, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Along with economic shocks and conflict, these continue to erase hard-won development gains. And while new technologies are creating new possibilities but dividing people. Such challenges demand collective solutions. In this 30th anniversary of the Copenhagen Declaration, we have an important opportunity to drive progress, the Second World Summit for Social Development. Let's keep working together to make the most of that important gathering and help build a more just, secure, and united world that we so desperately need.
As the Secretary General said, insecurity and deep distrust is rife across the world. That's echoed in the findings of the World Social Report 2025, titled A New Policy Consensus to Accelerate Social Progress. Let's dive into the World Social Report now, which is UN-DESA's flagship publication on social issues. For the first time, the 2025 edition is a joint product of UN-DESA and UNU-WIDER. We have its lead authors with us today to talk about the report's main findings and messages. Here in the studio with me is Marta Roach, Chief of the Emerging Issues and Trends in Development section at UN-DESA. And joining us virtually from Helsinki, Finland, we have Patricia Justino, Deputy Director of UNU-WIDER. Welcome to you both. Thank you, ladies, for joining us. So Marta, first question to you. How is this year's World Social Report different from previous editions?
Sure, thanks so much, Shax. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So this World Social Report has a very long history in the UN, but this edition is different because of its timing. This year we celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Copenhagen Declaration for Social Development, which was signed this month in March in 1995. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to take stock of how far we have come, what challenges remain, but also what new challenges have arisen that were not there in the 1990s. Of course, this means looking back at progress made in the commitments that were made in Copenhagen, including poverty eradication, the promotion of productive employment and decent work, and social integration, not least because these commitments have not been met yet, but also looking, as I said, to new challenges, and chief among them is the declines in trust and the social polarization that we are witnessing right now. But also increasing link to this is increasing insecurity. People are uncertain about the future more and more, and persistent inequalities. So now, as member states prepare for the second World Summit for Social Development, we thought it would be important to present a broad assessment, facts-based assessment of the social situation, so that their deliberations can be based not on assumptions, but on actual data.
Patricia, please share with us the report's key findings in terms of data. What are the standout numbers?
Thank you. Let me first start with the good news. The good news is that the world has made extraordinary social and economic progress over the last 30 years. And this is especially so in the fight against extreme poverty. Since 1995, more than 1 billion people have escaped extreme poverty. This is a very impressive number. And even so, when we think about all the setbacks that we faced since 1995, more recently the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the picture is not completely rosy. And as we show in the report, a lot of people in the world don't feel that progress. Around 40% of the world's population believes that life is worse now than it was 50 years ago. We try to dive in to understand why this is the case, and three main reasons come forward. The very first one is it is clear not everyone has shared the benefits of progress. Inequality remains very high, both within and between countries. And currently, 2/3 of the world population live in countries where income inequality has increased since 1995. The second reason is economic insecurity, and it's widespread. This is for various reasons: conflicts, climate threats, recent economic crisis. They have shown that a large fraction of the world population is only one shock away from poverty. This is true both in developed and developing countries. This is not just a problem of developing countries. And across the world, millions struggle to make ends meet. And then what we observe on top of this is these high levels of inequality, the economic insecurity that people perceive to be in is fueling distrust and is leading to lower social cohesion. Distrust in government is widespread, distrust in other institutions as well. And this is deepening social and political divides and increasing social polarization across the world. So what essentially what we show in the report is that we seem to be trapped in a vicious cycle with economic insecurity, inequality, declining trust, and social fragmentation feeding on each other. And ultimately, this vicious cycle is threatening social contracts and the foundations of global solidarity and multilateralism overall.
I'm going to be talking about that issue of declining trust soon. First, Marta, please tell us what are the main findings of the report with regards to policy?
Yes. So many see these social challenges that Patricia has described, or let's call it a social crisis, because we are facing a social crisis, as the result of the recent wave of shocks, mostly the pandemic, but also other economic shocks that came as a result of the pandemic and then recent geopolitical conflicts. A key message of the report is that these social challenges have been a long time in the making. That the rapid process of globalization and the pace of technological change as well benefited for sure many people, but also unsettled lives and societies and even the planet itself. So another key message of the report, though, is that the social crisis was not inevitable. That in fact, policy choices on occasion, instead of making things better, made things worse. That, of course, yes, technological change has pushed inequality upwards, but there have been certain policies that have made the effects of technological change even worse, to put an example. So how do we fix this? How do we repair the social contract, which is what needs to be repaired? The key message from the report is that small fixes won't be sufficient, that we cannot just patch holes with small programs here and there until the next crisis hits, that we need a complete shift in policies and even in norms and mindsets. So a deep rethink of policy frameworks so that we can strengthen resilience instead of going from shock to shock, from crisis to crisis.
We're going to look at what to do very shortly. Let's go back to what you were telling us about that decline in trust, Patricia. This fall in trust is an issue as far as governments go, how people see their governments, but also between people, right? What's going on?
Yes, so this is one of the big messages of the report. We observe a decline in trust almost in all regions in the world over the last 20 years. And obviously, this is a problem. Trust is a key pillar of social cohesion. So without trust, without social trust, people are less likely to comply with the rules of society. Things like anything from paying taxes to obeying the law to recycling are affected by changes in trust. And without trust in others, cooperation and communication across different social groups becomes extremely difficult. What we show is today, more than half of the population in the world have little or no trust in their governments. And what is more concerning is the fact that this number has been increasing from cohort to cohort, so from one generation to the next generation. About a quarter of people that were born in the 1990s, which are now in their 20s, early 30s, have no trust whatsoever in their governments. And so if this trend continues the way it is, we will see the emerging of societies which are less and less trusting. And like you said, Jacques, this is not just about institutions, it's also about people. Trust in people is also low. Less than 30% of people think that others in their society, in their communities, can be trusted. These are very low numbers. One concerning feature is we have observed some of these declines in trust in the past, but what we're observing today is this form of polarization is becoming more entrenched, and these agreements are turning into animosity, and more we have these discourses about us versus the others, and distrusting those that are not like us, that do not look like us, that do not behave like us. And of course, I mean, a lot has been said about the role of digital technologies in explaining some of these trends. We all know the potential that gets uncovered by advances in digital technologies, but they are also contributing to this erosion in social cohesion and trust. We've been talking a long time about widespread mis and disinformation, fueling social and political polarization, obstructing positive public dialogue and civic participation. And the thing at the end of the day is that how people feel about their own lives and how people feel about the world around them matters for trust. And this also includes how they perceive their institutions and their governments to be delivering on their promises. For instance, one thing that we show in the result is a strong correlation between perceptions of inequality and trust in institutions. And there's also a strong relationship between how people perceive their own economic situation. And we, as I mentioned before, this comes with a lot of uncertainty and a lot of economic insecurity. And the relationship between that and trust is there. And we can't claim, and we're not making claims of causality, but we show very, very strong correlations between how people feel and how that gets translated into their levels of trust. Marta mentioned already, this is something that concerns not just to governments, but also to the international community in general.
So what do we do about this? The report is calling for a new policy consensus. Marta, what should that new consensus consist of?
Well, we think, based on the analysis in the report, that a new policy consensus should be based on 3 broad and mutually reinforcing principles: equity, economic security for everyone, and solidarity. So what does this mean in practice? Let's start with equity. Equity requires investing more and better in people. And I'm using the word investment purposely, because usually we talk about social expenditure as it's something that you spend and it has no returns, but social investments have large returns in the long term, right? So investing more and better means investing in services and making sure that they work for everyone. By services, I mean education, health, and other services. Investing in social protection systems as well, eliminating the barriers that prevent people from participating in social, economic, and political life. That's just some examples. What does it mean to promote economic security for all? Well, you have to make sure that people are resilient and thus protected against crisis. That we are not only protecting markets when a crisis hits or banks, but we are protecting people. But also that you're giving people opportunities, and the best way to give people opportunities is through making true on that promise of promoting productive employment and decent work for all, for example. And then there's the issue of solidarity and distrust. That requires more than better policies alone, right? That requires action by all stakeholders in society. It has to be a whole of society effort, because you need to change norms and mindsets. So civil society, the private sector, large corporations in particular, which have a lot of power. Everybody needs to work in sync to promote solidarity and trust. So overall, maybe the main message from the report here is that social policies are extremely important in this new policy consensus, but by themselves are not sufficient. What you need is a whole of government integrated policy framework, which Copenhagen already promoted 30 years ago, and which still haven't made true, to make sure that all policies work together, that we don't have microeconomic policies that are undoing the effect of social policies, for instance.
Because everything is linked.
Because everything is linked. Because if you have a taxation policy that's making the poor poorer, while you're giving transfer to people in poverty so they can escape poverty, you are not doing anything in the end.
So you just said, Marta, that we need a whole of society, whole of government approach. Patricia, clearly governments alone cannot solve the complex social challenges that we face today, can they?
No, that's the straightforward answer. Governments alone cannot face these challenges. We're talking about climate change, conflicts. I mean, the numbers show that the period between 2020 and 2023 was the most violent since the Cold War. Pandemics, economic recessions. These are global challenges that require global solutions. There's not a single government that will be able to address this on their own. And these are challenges that are not contained within borders. They affect us all, independently of borders. But sadly, what we're observing is, instead of striving to find global solutions that work for all, what we're observing is the rise of nationalistic policies, inward-looking governments across the world. And this is not helping, and the challenges are becoming more entrenched and difficult to address. And what it does show is, at the moment, the international community is really at a critical juncture. We now know that the world is off track to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And we will not be back on track if we do not find ways of increasing, essentially, global cooperation. In the recently signed Pact for the Future in September at UN General Assembly, member states have recommitted to urgently accelerate progress towards achieving the SDGs. The member states have pledged to a new beginning in multilateralism, I'm quoting, based and striving for a stronger multilateral system. I do hope that this pledge takes place, even though what we're observing in the world today seems that we are moving away from it, even though this pledge was made 6 months ago, or less than 6 months ago. So, but this is not just a pledge made by governments in isolation. This involves us, the United Nations, the global international community, but also every single citizen in the world. Everyone needs to play their role if we are to get back on track and in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030.
I have a question for you both. How do you think international organizations, including the UN, should support national efforts to tackle inequality and social fragmentation? Marta, we could start with you first.
Sure. So we are presenting findings from the World Social Report. That's one way in which the UN can help, through the production of data, knowledge, and policy guidance that can help governments, implement more effective policies. That's one. The other one is obviously coordination and cooperation. As Patricia said, many of today's challenges are global. And let's not think only of the most obvious ones, such as climate change, but even inequality within countries. Many of the drivers of inequality within countries are global. Global financial flows, trade flows, labor regulations that don't depend only on one government, but are at the end are set in a global context, right? All these things require coordination and cooperation. So the UN provides the global convening space for member states to come together and align their efforts, or at least discuss disagreements and agree to disagree. But at least also I would say that the UN is not only a global convener, but it also can open spaces of deliberation at the national level and amplify the voices of people and groups of people that are usually excluded from political debates. So that's one. Another one would be accountability, right? The UN can help countries set measurable targets and monitor progress towards those targets. The UN cannot replace national governments, obviously, but it can make their policies more effective so that they can create more sustainable social frameworks.
Patricia, what do you think? How can the UN and other international organizations support national efforts?
Well, I mean, Marta covered quite a lot of ground, but what I would emphasize is the importance of the United Nations as a convener and facilitating dialogue, and especially between countries or social groups that disagree. What we're observing through whatever the reasons this is happening, whatever the pathways we're seeing whereby this is happening, mistrust is becoming more and more entrenched, social polarization, this idea that I mentioned before of us versus the others. These problems cannot be solved unless dialogue happens. You know, people listen to the other side of the argument in a positive way, and promoting dialogue and debate is critical to how the United Nations operates. Like Marta mentioned, the United Nations is not going to replace governments, not going to replace national leadership, but it can sort of create a pathway by mediating disagreements and often tensions as well. And this role is fundamental in creating this safe space where different people with different opinions can come together, hopefully to find an agreement.
Well, as you both said, you at least need to have somewhere to come together, even if it is just to agree to disagree. Now, we know that accurate data is so important to sound decision-making. Marta, how can this year's World Social Report help inform the discussions that are taking or will take place at the second World Summit for Social Development being held in Doha in November?
Sure. So actually in the report we include some concrete proposals or recommendations for the World Social Summit. But let me say first that the objectives set in the first Copenhagen Summit in 1995 and those in the Agenda 2030 are as relevant today as they were when they were set. And they have not been met. And the same with the principles that were agreed to in those two summits. So we have the how, the what, sorry, we have the what. We have the what, we have the objectives. What we need to figure out is the how to accelerate progress, but not only to accelerate progress, to make sure that progress is sustained in the long term. Because there have been periods of accelerated progress in the past, but then we go back to zero when the next crisis hits. Right? So we need to make sure that progress is sustainable. So what recommendations do we make in the World Social Report? In a few words, one is, I had talked earlier about investing better in people. So one way to do so is by making sure that services are not only accessible, public services accessible to people, but they are of good quality. The summit can provide a platform to agree on financial and also technical cooperation that is needed to strengthen the institutions that can provide these services. That's one. Another one is the long-standing commitment to promoting decent work, which is a very, very important one. One government alone has limited power to improve the working standards and working conditions of workers in their country. You need this global platform to coordinate action, to agree to invest in labor market institutions, right? And to agree on a certain labor standards that should be met by all countries. So that's another one. A third one is social protection. We are still far from the goal of universal social protection. Some countries can finance universal social protection systems by their own. They can bridge the gap with domestic resources, but maybe many low-income countries cannot. So hopefully the World Summit can result in concrete commitments to help these countries that cannot provide social protection on their own, and maybe concrete commitment to debt relief, which is so important for these countries also to move forward. There's two other recommendations that we make, and thus are even more important than this. We need integrated whole of government policies to address the social challenges we face today. We cannot stay at sectoral policies. Yes, health policies are very important, educational policies are very important, but we need a whole of government approach to address these challenges. And we need more than that. We need a whole of society approach, as we said earlier. Every individual must be involved. And the last thing is that what's important about policy is not only how policies are designed, what policy agreements we make here, but how policies are implemented, right? And here, what we need to make sure is that the people affected by the policies that will be put in place, affected or who will benefit from them, have a say on how these policies will be implemented, that at least they are on board with them, that the policies, when they are implemented, will not lead to large protests because they have unintended impacts. So hopefully the World Social Summit can open spaces for deliberation, not only here at the intergovernmental level, but at the national level as well.
I have one last question for you both. What is one big takeaway from the report that policymakers and other stakeholders should pay attention to? Patricia, over to you first.
Okay. Well, we have talked about very difficult issues, and the report and this discussion has not painted the brightest of pictures, right? But we should not lose sight of the reasons for the Copenhagen Declaration in '95 and the 2030 Agenda. These challenges, these global challenges, cannot be solved if we lose our sense of equity, of security, of solidarity to guide policies and institutional transformation alike. But the thing is, the things we're talking about, inequality, insecurity, social fragmentation, etc., people often think about that as abstract issues. And it's difficult to grasp, but most people, if asked, will find it very difficult to say how much inequality is there in their country. And this has been shown. But the fact is, all these factors shape our daily lives in very real ways that sometimes are not quite grasped. And but at the end of the day, what I think one of the key messages of the report is, despite all these abstract discussions, despite all the tremendous challenges we face, we cannot lose sight of the individual. At the end of the day, what all we're discussing is about ordinary people and how people feel about these global problems, but how do they feel, how do these problems manifest themselves in their day-to-day lives? And these are the voices that need to be at the table, and they need to be heard. Again, going back to what I said before, this is definitely one of the roles the UN can play, because if voices do not get heard, and they don't get heard in a positive way, the negative messages take over, and those are the ones that dominate. And if we don't pay attention to the realities of people's lives, and people telling us, yes, my life is more difficult now than it was decades ago, well, we might be moving into a much darker place. And so it's important that we pay attention to how these global problems manifest themselves in ordinary lives on a day-to-day basis.
Marta, what do you think?
Well, Patricia has provided a very exhaustive answer. Just to illustrate what she's saying. In a global survey on life satisfaction, 60% of people say they are struggling. Let's listen to that. 12% say that they are more than suffering. So 3/4 of the world population is either struggling or suffering, or that's how they feel, right? So we have to listen to that. And yes, the issues we analyze in the report may seem very abstract, but insecurity is affecting everyone. We see it every day. There's a growing gig economy where people work from day to day without knowing how many hours they will have of work tomorrow. That affects families. And that people feel that they are just one step away. They lose their job, they don't have social protection, they are one step away from falling into poverty. Inequality, again, a very abstract term. Nobody will know how high inequality is in their country. But we present evidence of the fact that inequality has negative impacts on, say, economic stability or social mobility, or that in countries with high inequality, wealthy individuals and corporations tend to capture political process and manipulate them towards their interests. So all these things have very practical implications on people's life. I would just say what Patricia said, that the vision of the Agenda 2030 and Copenhagen remain within reach, but only if we have equality, economic security, and solidarity at the top of the policy agendas of every country.
Ladies, thank you both very much indeed for that very illuminating conversation. Now, 2025 is a hallmark year to advance the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals. From November 4th to the 6th, the world will gather in Doha, Qatar for the Second World Summit for Social Development. The summit aims to continue the work started by the 1995 Copenhagen Summit, focusing on advancing global efforts to create a more inclusive and fairer world. The Social Summit will address the gaps and recommit to the Copenhagen Declaration on Social Development and the Program of Action and its implementation, and give momentum towards the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The Second World Summit for Social Development is expected to adopt a concise, action-oriented political declaration. The President of the General Assembly has appointed the permanent representatives of Belgium and Morocco to facilitate the intergovernmental negotiations in an open and transparent manner. The Social Summit will convene just a few months after the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development. That's being held in Seville, Spain from June 30th to July 3rd this year. That conference will be attended by leaders from governments along with international and regional organizations, financial and trade institutions, businesses, civil society, and the UN system at the highest levels. It's the only space where all these different stakeholders will come together, and it'll provide a unique opportunity to improve financing at all levels, including supporting reform of the international financial architecture. It'll help foster stronger international cooperation. And joining me now in the studio is Li Junhua, Under Secretary General of UN DESA, His Excellency Omar Hilal, Permanent Representative of the Kingdom of Morocco to the United Nations, Her Excellency Alia Ahmed Saif Al Thani, Permanent Representative of the State of Qatar to the United Nations, and His Excellency Hector Jose Gomez Hernandez, Permanent Representative of Spain to the United Nations. And joining us online from Santiago, Chile, we have His Excellency Juan Somavia, former permanent representative of Chile to the United Nations. He's also a former Director General of the International Labour Organization and an honorary member of the Club de Madrid. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for being here with us. Mr. Lee, we could start with you, please. What role will the Second World Summit for Social Development and the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development play to help advance the Sustainable Development Goals?
Well, thank you. Certainly, from Copenhagen First World Social Summit to the Addis Ababa Action Agenda in 2015, and also the 2030 Agenda, all those events are landmarked events for the UN leadership that are on the Sustainable Development Cooperation. So now we are going to have the Second World Social Summit, building the momentum from the first summit. And then also certainly we need to take the stock, what we have achieved, what is left behind, and what will be the way forward. So I certainly believe for the first World Social Summit, leaders put the people at the center of the whole process. And then for the 2030, we definitely follow that quarter of the core. So I believe over the past several years, based on our assessment, there are a number of very impressive progresses, but also we are facing a very deep challenges. For instance, like the insecurity, the sense of the insecurity. For instance, like the economic uncertainties. For instance, like the lower trust on the government and public institutions. And then also, we need to talk about how we could further generate decent jobs for our people, particularly for young people. So all those things need to be further elaborated at the leaders level, at the ministerial level, to integrate the policy from every link of the social agenda. So I'm definitely believe that when the leaders adopted this political declaration, then they are going to map out the new chart for all of us to move the needle forward in all those dimensions, from the sense of the security, from increase the social trust on the public institutions, and then also to mobilize the more investment on social pillar. And since we are moving from the Seville to Doha, then I definitely believe those two landmark events will be intertwined with each other. Success for the Seville conference was certainly laid on a very solid foundation for the success in Doha. Vice versa, the success in Doha will be further amplified the success in Seville. So that's why we certainly call on all stakeholders to engage with the UN to launch this landmark process, to recommit ourselves to multilateralism and to reshape the course of the action.
Ambassador António, Qatar is hosting the Second World Summit for Social Development. Why is this summit important to your country?
Thank you so much. Pleased to be here with dear colleagues. Of course, for the last 3 decades, the state of Qatar has invested a lot in the socio-economic part of the UN agenda. And of course, we have offered the space and the resources to achieve these objectives. 5 major UN conferences were held in Doha, from the second United Nations Conference on the Financing for Development in 2008 until the most recent UN conference we have hosted in Doha in 2023, which is the 5th United Nations Conference on the least developed countries. We're very proud, of course, that Doha is the host of the Second World Summit for Social Development. This is a very important moment. The last summit on social development was held in 1995 in Copenhagen. So again, it's an opportunity after 30 years to build momentum, to reaffirm our commitment to the Copenhagen Plan of Action, and as well to use it as an opportunity to generate momentum to adopt a new outcome that will galvanize the achievement of the 2030 agenda, and as well the Pact of the Future, and as well to ensure that social development is at the heart of our global agenda. We're very much excited and engaged closely with the UN Secretariat under the leadership of the Secretary-General, Deputy Secretary-General, my dear friend Under Secretary-General Lee Genoa, to make sure the summit in Doha is a big success. We are expecting over 14,000 people to participate. This will be among the class of the most major UN conferences to be held. The participation will be from member states, civil society, NGOs, UN agencies, academia, and the private sector. For us, it's very important that the Doha summit delivers a result-driven summit. This is a key objective for us in the lead-up to the summit in Doha.
Ambassador Hilal, you and the permanent representative of Belgium have been appointed to facilitate intergovernmental negotiations for the summit in Doha. In your opinion, what is the value of the Copenhagen Declaration and program of action for that upcoming summit?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank my good friend Lee and his department for celebrating this 30th anniversary. This anniversary is coming in timely and crucial moment. And our meeting today is not only the 30th anniversary, but it's a moment to cherish and renew the spirit of Copenhagen. Spirit of commitment that represents social development, which is needed today more than any time. 30 years ago, Copenhagen Summit marked a light of hope and unequivocal call to action. Leaders of that era were really revolutionary people because they shared common vision of eradicating poverty, secure for employment, and foster true social integration. And they agreed that social development cannot, and social justice cannot be obtained with, in absence of peace, in absence of justice, in absence of respect of human rights. So these ideals and principles of Copenhagen, 30 years after, they are still valid. They are still pertinent. And we have to continue keeping working on them and improve them and enlarge them for the whole population. But how we see this continuum in the principles is we need more engagement. These commitments are also crucial to face several existing and emerging challenges: climate crisis, digital divides, global health emergencies, economic shocks, geopolitical tension and war all around the world, and solidarity erosion. These challenges and unfinished business of Copenhagen, and I'm sorry to use unfinished business because that's the fact. It's not. We would be very happy to say that everything was successful and mission accomplished, but we have to recognize that there is still a lot to do. So we have to, the fact that Copenhagen was not, all the principles and the outcome of Copenhagen was not finished, I think it's challenging multilateralism. It's also testing our resilience. It's also mobilizing our social fabric, and we shall do the necessary effort and action to be up to the test. Today, as we honor the legacy of Copenhagen, the Second World Summit for Social Development shall embrace audacious vision for the future. We need collective commitment. We need political will. We need more solidarity. And we need the fact that the world have to change in better way. As we are shaping the path toward the summit, let's make of this intergovernmental process a turning point, a moment when we transform values and principles into innovative action that tackle the challenges of today. The summit shall be also a vehicle to create an environment for building trust, give momentum to the implementation of 2030 agenda, promote innovative solutions, and inclusive international cooperation. The Kingdom of Morocco and Belgium as co-facilitators have the honor to join efforts to steering the intergovernmental process of this historic summit that will take place in Doha. Ambassador Smith and I remain committed and dedicated to facilitating the intergovernmental negotiation with transparency and inclusivity, and with the aim to achieve an outcome that is forward-looking, action-oriented, and consensus-driven. I thank you very much.
Thank you. So as we're hearing Ambassador Gomez, both the Social Summit and the Financing for Development Conference that Spain is hosting present key opportunities to drive progress for the Sustainable Development Goals. How do you think these meetings can reinforce each other and generate political momentum, as Ms. Lee was saying, and secure sustainable financing for social development?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having us here today. It's a great initiative to launch a debate on how to process Connect. As a host country, Spain, we are very optimistic with the Social Summit and the FFD4 in Seville. I think we need to send a very strong message. For us, for Spain, we do not see FFD4 as only about the financing. It's about the multilateralism at its core. It's very important to send this message. And I would like to say as well, we take this opportunity to call all the member states and the stakeholders to participate in this conference at the highest level. The highest level. Spain, Europe, Africa, Latin America,
Qatar, or all the member states, we have a lot of challenge in gender, climate action, private sector. I think it's very important the role the private sector in this process. We have been meeting in Washington DC the last week with the World Bank, IMF, with the stakeholders, and so maybe it's the last chance we have to before 2030. The last chance before 2030, and we need to have an outcome document as soon as possible. It's very important to close the document before Seville, and I see the opportunity in this process, and fully support the co-facilitator of the FAT4, Nepal, Zambia, Mexico, and Norway, and the co-facilitator as well of the Social Summit, Belgium and Morocco, and my dear colleagues of Qatar, Alia. We must I think this opportunity is very important for UN. Maybe it's not the best moment for the multilateralism. We have a lot of challenge. We need to work in this way.
Ambassador Somavia, over to you now. The idea for a social development summit was your brainchild. You proposed it in 1991 when you were the chair of the ECOSOC Social Committee at the time. You also chaired the preparatory committee and the main committee of the first social summit in 1995. From your perspective, how did the international context in 1995 influence what was accomplished in Copenhagen, and what can the UN accomplish at the summit in Doha with the current global situation?
Shanks, thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. It's an issue that's close to my heart because those accidents of life, I had all those responsibilities in the social summit. I think that the context couldn't be more different. And yet the objective is the same. What is the opportunity for the UN then, and what should be the opportunity now? Then it was a moment of hope, a moment in which the Cold War had come to an end, in which we hadn't had a nuclear war, and the space that security issues and geopolitical issues occupied in the international dialogue had been reduced. So there was an opportunity to get into the international arena, other issues. Basically, there were environment in Rio, Beijing, women in Beijing, and the social summit. The way it happened was very interesting because the Secretary-General, once this was proposed, there were some oppositions that asked me to consult. And I consulted in his name for about 6 or 7 months. And the result was that it wasn't that there was a gigantic crisis, but everybody knew that you had social problems. And they were given a sort of developmental dimension. The mood today is completely different. It was very well described by the Summit of the Future, that the sense of discontent, disconnect, polarization are a true obstacle to understanding. We were talking before about the UN and talking and communicating, and we know how difficult this has become, much more difficult. And yet we have to persist. And the situation of the UN then and now is also different. Then there was the notion that we could be thinking about social development. It came absolutely naturally that you do that in the UN, and it was a UN that was trusted. And it was natural to do it there. Today it's also natural, but the questioning of the UN is very, very strong. Obviously on security matters because of the situation of the Security Council. But if you take a look at, other spaces of the UN system, you can see that those are discovered by social issues is not exactly the same level of criticism as before, and I will go into that. But a UN that was trusted, a UN that is being criticized. So what do you do in that context? In Copenhagen, it was very clear, full support, full political support to the fact that the UN has the United Nations system has a social development mandate. And without calling it that, I think that we should begin calling it, but without calling it then, for many countries at the summit, that was much more important than the security issues that were discussed in the Security Council. And it continues to be so, because people perceive the issues that people are dealt with the social mandate that the United Nations has. And I think that that is probably the most important thing that we should highlight, that Doha could do. Doha can simply say, institutionalize the fact that we have a mandate. There's a security mandate and there's a social development mandate. And it's a mandate of the system because it's made up of things that are being done in all of the specialized agencies, funds and programs. There's part of it in the Constitution, in the Charter, but obviously it's the result of conglomerating all of those things that we're doing elsewhere. So if we can put that at the center of what we're doing, and I'm going to talk more than the subjects themselves about the institutionality and how do we get things going. I believe that that would be a very central thing. The institutionalization of the fact that the United Nations system has a social mandate, and that social mandate should have an equal space, and for many a much more important space than security issues. Now, the success of a summit is also linked to something that is very important. How many people go there? The fact that this was the first social summit, and that there were, everybody was considering that things needed to be addressed, well, made the social summit in Copenhagen the biggest meeting of heads of state and prime ministers in the history of the UN at the time. There have been bigger ones later. Could we have an important presence? What would happen if the presence is extremely important? And we say, look, the people, all of these heads of state and prime ministers have come to Doha because this is the key point. We want to reinforce the United Nations in the issue that is linked to people's interests, to individuals, families, communities. And that's why we're here. We're going to have a good declaration that I have no doubt it's in very good hands. But a declaration that is approved by a lot of prime ministers would have an enormous impact. So the content, but also the participation, I think is going to be an essential point. And I am certain that there are a lot of people that want to go there, but also, you have to sell the product. It's part of with the amount of things that presidents have to do. And after a General Assembly that is going to take place 2 months before, it's something that I think that we have to put a lot of emphasis on.
Ambassador Hilal, back to you. So what are the next steps in the political process for the summit in Doha?
Next step is very clear in our mind. We have already prepared the food for thought. The reaction that we got, first reaction that we got, are very encouraging. And we consider that the political declaration will be like a blueprint for advancing social development in line with the mandates given by the General Assembly. We are now at a very important and crucial moment of the process. We will have a meeting of member states on 28th to listen to their reactions. And 2 weeks after, we will present draft 0. That will be a moment of truth. So we are expecting things to go smoothly because we have been working since the beginning in very transparent and inclusive manner. And as I said a few minutes ago, we have been in Geneva. We intend to go to Nairobi. We will go to Paris to meet with UNESCO, Nairobi with the Habitat, because all the UN agencies that are handling one of the aspects of the social development will be visited, and we will meet their members, and we will listen to their advices and recommendations. And of course, the civil society is included in our conduct because we want to listen to the whole component. For example, in Geneva last week, we met with the High Commissioner for Refugees, because refugees are very important element of the puzzle. We met with the High Commission for Human Rights. By preparing the food for thought, we have taken the decision to not let anything aside or to consider any issue as taboo. That's why I think we got a very positive reaction. And of course, we believe that we are just co-facilitators. We present the documents, and in the end, it's the room that will decide how the documents will be, which content the document will have. But on this issue, we will do our best to reduce gaps, to convince people for more flexibility, to ask them to show their political will, and also to put them behind their responsibilities, because the document have to be adopted by consensus. And the time for negotiations will be from April till end of June, beginning of July, and we intend to finish our work at this time. It's a goal that needs the collaboration and the cooperation of everybody. We remain in this process. We have to be optimistic. It doesn't mean that the rest of the world is as optimistic as we are. As we say to my colleague, Hector, we will depend on the result of the outcome of Seville. And as the Secretary-General, my good friend Lee, he said, the success of Seville will impact the success of Doha. And the success on Doha will amplify, that's the word that you use, will amplify what have been decided in Seville and what will be decided in the future. So there is a continuum, and everything is interlinked. And the fact that the UN is working on such important and crucial issues of the humanity in the time that there is wars, there is tensions, there is shocks, there is many things, that's a real chance for the UN and the multilateralism. And the UN is the heart, the beating heart of the multilateralism and its chance, because when wars are going on outside, we are shaping the way and the conditions for better world for next generations. I thank you.
Thank you again, sir. Ambassador Al-Thani, from your point of view, how can member states leverage the summit in Doha to make real change, much needed change, with so many people facing such profound social challenges?
Thank you so much. I mean, let me begin by showing our great support to the great efforts and the ongoing intergovernmental negotiations on reaching an outcome for the summit, which is within the political declaration, with the great efforts and able efforts of the co-facilitators, Ambassador Omar Hilal and Ambassador Sophie Smith of Belgium and Morocco. This is a very critical moment to bring us together to have a successful outcome in the summit. What a successful outcome should mean. We're not here negotiating a document, but we are negotiating an outcome that will reaffirm the synergy between the core themes of social development, which is eradicating poverty, providing work, the productive and decent work for all, and creating the social integration. So these are three important aspects that should be the heart of the political declaration. It should be action-oriented. It should be concise and action-oriented. We need key deliverables, actual deliverables on the ground. We need to keep in mind that these concrete actions are meant to improve lives. This is the end game. We are not negotiating for the purpose of negotiating. We are negotiating to improve lives of peoples and nations. So I think this is a key outcome that we need to keep in mind. And this brings me to what Ambassador Somavia, he's a great and an inspiration for all of us when it comes to the socioeconomic component of the UN agenda. He particularly pointed out that the Doha summit is an opportunity to create a credible process of follow-up and assessment. So the end game is not the summit, it's what comes after the Doha summit. So I think this is what we need, creating the momentum, and to end on the point of everything is linked. And this is why we look up to the success of FFD4, providing the resources to implement the socioeconomic part of the UN agenda is key for the success in Doha. So this is why we are very much looking closely at FFD4, making sure it is a success, and this is why we are working closely together to making sure the Doha Summit on Social Development is a success as well.
Ambassador Gomez, so member state deliberations on the outcomes of the financing conference in Spain are already relatively advanced. What do you see, what do you hope will be the main outcomes?
I think the document, I think, for example, we are getting very good feedback on high-level participation in FFD4. It's a very good, the feeling is very good at the now. I think we can reach a participation, for example, of 60 head of state or head of government. It's very important. It's very important the participation in FFD4. Like I said, we need a strong message in FFD4 in Sevilla, and the participation as well as the private sector. But now maybe the geopolitical situation doesn't play in our favor. We know, and now we need the leadership of UN and the political leadership as well. For example, my Prime Minister is very, very involved in this process. In the FFD4. The world must reach the 4 trillion annual financing gap to rescue SDGs. Is the message. And so we need to work with the stakeholders. Why UN? Because UN, we can work with the World Bank, the IMF, the stakeholders, and maybe it's the best moment to respond the different countries now are fighting with the multilateralism. So it's an opportunity. I agree with my dear colleagues of Qatar, FFD4 and Social Summit. Maybe the most important process this year in UN is where we can respond the challenge, And so the people, they are waiting for us, for the member states. And so, term, leadership, and leadership.
Mr. Lee, how is UN-DESA supporting member states for both of these events?
Well, thank you. We are very grateful to the political leadership demonstrated by the member states. And also we are very grateful to the partnership demonstrated by the whole UN system. DESA actually is doing a secretariat support, coordinating the whole UN system to provide our professional, analytical, and intergovernmental support first to the member states, led by the co-facilitators, and then also negotiations, and it's definitely also to our hosts. And within the secretariat, we actually have launched interagency task forces, chaired by the Deputy Secretary General. Within these task forces, we conducted a cross-cutting discussions, brainstorming to consolidate inputs from the various UN entities, from the country level to regional level to global level, to inform the member states, to enrich their scope on the discussions and also define the final outcome. For instance, the latest version we are going to launch for the World Social Report, we, based on our assessment, up to now, even though we achieved enormously for the poverty eradication, but the picture is very mixed. We are not going to eradicate all of the hardship for the people, and that actually there are 10 million people who are living within the extreme poverty to the poverty lines, and there are 2.8 billion people who do not have access to the social protection. So that's the harsh reality. And with regard to the financing, with regard to the debt, we know, globally speaking, there are a huge gap, like the $4 trillion annually in SDG financing. So that's the harsh reality we are facing. I fully echo the ambassador's remarks that for these two events, we need the political leadership with a vision and also with action. So that's why we do our best to support the member states, co-facilitators, to develop a full-fledged outcome document with vision, with action, and we hope that we can land it with a very impact and ambitious outcome. But we are not going to stop there. What makes things more even pressing is to implement all those commitments, all those actions with the mechanism, with a follow-up. On that, definitely, again, we count on the leadership by the member states with the vision and with their absolute partnership to drive the needle forward.
Last question to you, Ambassador Somavia. How do you think the UN should follow up on the outcomes of the summit in Doha?
Well, I'm going to take a little bit of time because I think that there are a number of things that need to be done, but I'll begin with the leadership issue. Leadership is very often seen as leaders, individuals, but often leadership is collective. And what we're now facing is the possibility of a preparatory process led by two ambassadors of experience and with a group of people that, if we take a look at the food for thought paper, have to find the basic structures of the issues that need to be addressed. So that's where the leadership is now and should stay, and I'm certain that this will happen because we're going to have a declaration that has the worth. The problem is, what do we do with it? And this is what I would like to address. The first one goes in the sense of what Ambassador Hilali was saying. He's mentioning that he's visiting the different agencies that have a social mandate. That is probably going to be the biggest institutional change that the Doha summit can generate. What do I mean? When you talk about the United Nations system of social, there's a mandate, the United Nations system of social development. That mandate, yes, it's in part in the Constitution, paragraphs 2 and 4 of the preamble, ECOSOC, it's there. But the nitty-gritty is in individual organizations, in the ILO, in UNESCO, in FAO, in WHO, in UN Women, in UNICEF, in UNDP, and might add a couple of more, but not much more. It is those organizations that represent the mandate and represent the UN, the social UN, plus the bodies that go with it. And so what you need to do is make them work together much more than they do now. Because we don't have an overarching mandate. You have the individual mandates. If you have, look, when you put them all together, this is the UN mandate, so that would require for you to work together more and better than what you're doing now. That I believe in itself would imply a major change in the way within the United Nations system we work on this matter. The Secretary-General, the secretariats of a joint they could create a secretariat of joint technical and policy teams to develop and oversee the different dimensions of coordination and action that are necessary. So the follow-up, inevitably, the follow-up will have to include a structure in which this world is present and operates obviously in the context of ECOSOC and the social committee of ECOSOC. The second thing that I want to bring to mention is that in 1995 we agreed on something that has become a glaring gap in the implementation of the Copenhagen Summit. I refer to the need for integrated thinking, for policy integration, for the capacity to generate policy coherence among the different dimensions of the United Nations system and social development mandate, as well as among the 17 goals of the 2030 agenda. In the last 30 years, in all our major statements on economic, social, and environmental issues, we have dutifully repeated the call. Some progress has been made in the notion of multidimensional poverty and gender issues, but we are still stuck in a basically sectorial analytical framework perspective and the analytical perspective. And the institutions of government and the UN are sectorially oriented. So we have a knowledge and an organizational challenge. I think that the time has come to bite the bullet, to unpack the problem, and for the United Nations to take the initiative to say, we are going to say, and it's very well said in the food for thought, but now we have to act on it. And what the summit could do was to push towards the types of decisions that need to be taken in order to be able to work in a different internal context. It won't be easy because we have little experience. It's not as somebody came and said, no, but let me tell you how it's done. No, we've worked sectorially for a very, very long time. We think sectorially and we operate sectorially. And if we do not change that, we're going to miss on having efficient and effective social policies. And this is a national problem. This is exactly as it is. But in doing this, apropos of national problems, we also have to help countries. This system has to help countries develop their own priorities. Countries, all of this is, social development is country specific and regional specific. We set general rules and general objectives, but they happen at the region and they happen at the country. So the linkage of the UN to the real life work of saying, look, okay, you decided that in Copenhagen and in Doha, but for me these are the priorities and these are the major problems. And that may be very different and very varied. By the way, I recommend a report that the regional commissions just produced in relation to the position, the issues as seen from the different regions and the areas in which they coincide, the things that are different. Extremely useful and very practical document to look at. That sort of thing will need to be done very clearly in the future. The second, what can we do? That's the objective. The Secretary-General can launch a whole of UN institutional process of integrated thinking to develop the analytical foundations and the methodologies in diverse areas of social development policy integration and the assessment process, because you change the integration, you have to assess differently. Second, involve the regional commissions, the resident coordinators and country teams in helping developing policy integration, considering that implementing policies to address social problems and priorities is very regional and country is specific. And finally, I want to mention the following. We are very good at the UN at being bold and daring and ambitious on what to do. And that we propose, and the propositions that we make as a result of our negotiations. But not so much on how we do it, and very little on the obstacles ahead. And consequently, naturally, there is unfinished business, as Ambassador Hilal, my friend, was saying. So at some point in time, we will have to make those three analyses together. And you can say, well, let's do this. And okay, but what would be the obstacles? What are the problems? It doesn't mean that you don't do it, but that you move into proposing something with some clarity as to the difficulty and complexity of it. And that can be extremely useful when you come to the implementation process. But if you're left to a situation in which you have to find out the concrete obstacles that you have, and not much discussion has been had about that, but we do have a great plan and a great objective and a great commitment to do something, it's much more complicated. I think that all of the things that I'm saying are things that the United Nations system, the secretariats, and by system I refer to the secretariats on the one hand and the governments on others. And things that are a knowledge challenge and things that are organizational challenge are right before us, and I think that we're in a situation of tackling them. Let me finalize by saying that in 1995 we were entering in an era that excited us because of the multiple opportunities it brought with it. And in 2025, we're exiting an era with high levels of uncertainty and insecurity with what lies ahead. Ambassador Hilal made a reference to that. And that's why I think that we have to think of Doha as a summit of hope. Copenhagen was called the Summit of Hope. Copenhagen was called the People's Summit. Why shouldn't we have the hope that these sort of things can get going? That we will remember the moment in which at a certain moment the United Nations first of all affirmed itself and said, look, tell me where else in the world do we have an institution that is capable of thinking about social issues at the United Nations? Yeah, come and criticize it. Now you go ahead and do it somewhere else. Where? So we have to talk with a lot of self-certainty. Of course that all of the institutions can be modified and changed and gotten better. But that we have the mandate and we have the instruments to carry out that mandate, it's a reality. Doha can be a moment in which we make that very strong, and there can be a very strong institutional implications for the UN of the Doha process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all for your time here today, for sharing your vital insights with us. Thank you for all that you are doing. So, the legacy of the Copenhagen Declaration lives on as we continue to put people at the center of development and accelerate progress towards its commitments and the broader set of sustainable development goals. As we just heard, the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development and the 2nd World Summit for Social Development offer important opportunities to continue this work. We invite you to stay up to date and engaged in these discussions. Do look out as well for the World Social Report 2025. You'll find that at social.un.org in April. Many thanks once again to all our brilliant speakers and to you for tuning in. On behalf of UN DESA and UNU-WIDER, goodbye for now.